and Nate Rees. And then we have Mountaineers super volunteer Danielle Graham joining us as well. So this is our fall policy and advocacy updates. We do this twice a year. We did it last in June, so some of you may have joined then, and we'll do one of these again next spring. As we get started, we'd love for everyone to mute yourself. As I mentioned before, if you're still eating dinner or not in a place where you can be on video, feel free to keep your video off or um, keep your video on. We love to see your smiling faces. It's up to you. Thanks everyone for joining, especially with the events of last night and today, and thanks for prioritizing advocacy. For those who weren't able to attend tonight, we'll be recording this and sending it out to everyone afterwards. So if you have any friends who weren't able to join, other members, just let them know. If you can introduce yourself in the chat, just give us your name, your Mountaineers branch, and then your answer to an icebreaker question. What aspect of the Mountaineers policy agenda most inspires or draws you to take action? Landscape conservation, public lands funding, outdoor access, or climate action? And you can say all of the above as well. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. All right, can everyone see that? Great. So Connor and I are going to be tag teaming the initial presentation part of this before we hand it over to Danielle and do the advocacy workshop. But our objective tonight is to bring together conservation-minded mountaineers, members of our community that particularly are passionate about conservation and advocacy, as well as those of you who have taken our Advocacy 101 course to be able to get policy updates now that you're empowered to take action for advocacy issues. There's a lot going on in the world of policy and advocacy right now, so we'll share some updates from our side. And then at the end, we're going to workshop current advocacy opportunities together. So we'll start with just a brief overview of our advocacy here at the Mountaineers, how we do it, what it is, what we prioritize, talk about the election results and what that means for us, give some updates from both the federal side and the state side. Danielle is going to give an up close and personal account of what advocacy looks like. And then we're going to do an advocacy workshop. We're going to break into groups and workshop how to personalize a letter on some of our policy priorities. So, so you can leave tonight having taken action. If you're not up for doing that tonight, if you're just here to hear the updates and want to be a more passive participant, that's totally fine. You can feel free to drop off before the advocacy workshop, but we'd love to have you stay. So next up, I'm going to hand it over to Connor for a land acknowledgement.
Great. Thanks, Betsy. So I want to acknowledge that we all live, work, and recreate on the traditional lands of the Pacific Northwest Indian tribes. And as our community strives to recreate more mindfully and respectfully and learn about tribal rights and cultural lifeways of the native peoples of our region, that attending tribal events can be a great way to do that, to educate yourself and build your understanding of a particular people's connection to the lands that you love. Our shared home, the Salish Sea region, Washington State, the Pacific Northwest. Last month, I attended an Indigenous Peoples Day celebration at Squaxin Park, which is a city-managed park down in Olympia, where our Olympia branch has done some stewardship activities, and Mountaineers kayakers actually use the surrounding inlets for some of their paddling activities as well. And the photo shown here on the slide is from one of those activities. And that event that I attended was organized by the Squaxin Island tribe, and learning about the tribe's history and connection to the area while sharing some first foods. We had some clam chowder. Helped strengthen my connection to the history of one of the places that connects me and our Mountaineers community to the natural world. And I just encourage you to think about and seek out similar opportunities as they come up to learn about Native history and the outdoor places that you love.
Great. Thank you, Connor. And then just to close out the intro, why we do the work that we do, why we do these sorts of events, is because your advocacy is really powerful. Our goal here on staff at the Mountaineers is to cultivate our group of Mountaineers advocates to make a greater impact for conservation and recreation in Washington and beyond. And Mountaineers are particularly powerful advocates thanks to the things you see out in the landscape every day, whether you're climbing on a glacier of Mount Rainier, like the photo shows, or hiking through a forest, you see the challenges that our natural landscapes are facing, and you are able to tell compelling stories to lawmakers and land managers. So thanks for caring, thanks for doing the advocacy that you do and showing up tonight. Handing it over to Connor.
Great. Thanks, Betsy. So I see a lot of familiar faces here in the event. So I think a lot of you are generally familiar about the Mountaineers Conservation and Advocacy Program, the work that Betsy, Nate, and I do. But just as a refresher, wanted to share that there's three pillars of that work: education, stewardship, and advocacy. Right. So education and advocacy are staff-led, volunteer-supported at the Mountaineers, and stewardship is led by our volunteers and supported by staff and amplified by staff through our communications. So branches like the Olympia branch and several other Mountaineers branches have a conservation and stewardship committee that organizes stewardship and provides Mountaineers members opportunity to improve the land. So that's stewardship and education, whether it's e-learning, blogs, Mountaineers books, magazine articles. We're just looking for new opportunities and continue to educate our community about conservation and why Adventure with Purpose, how part of Adventure with Purpose is engaging in conservation. So advocacy, obviously the big one that we're all interested in, why we're here tonight. So we advocate as staff on behalf of our community, so doing direct advocacy, and also create grassroots advocacy opportunities for our members to engage. So I'm going to talk a little more about advocacy on the next slide. So advocacy has been a part of the Mountaineer story since our beginning. So when we think about our why, it's we don't just connect people to place, we don't just connect people to the natural world, build skills, teach safety. We're out on the landscape, and again, Adventure with Purpose. Advocacy and engagement in conservation has been a part of that. Mountaineers members, early Mountaineers members, helped protect Olympic National Park, and then pretty much every win, every big conservation victory in the state of Washington or the Pacific Northwest that has also national implications for just the evolution of the conservation movement, Mountaineers members have been involved in. So protecting like the Wilderness Act and the Alpine Lakes Wilderness and North Cascades National Park, and some more recent victories, the Great American Outdoors Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. So federal investments in conservation and climate. Mountaineers, both the staff kind of doing that direct advocacy, meeting with lawmakers and land managers, and then our members taking action, which we're going to talk about ways to do that tonight. That's kind of what that advocacy looks like. And then, we advocate to protect public lands and the outdoor experience. Kind of that's our frame. That's the lane that we start from. And then, I mentioned kind of how we advocate, what we prioritize. We kind of prioritize federal issues first. About 60%, about 2/3 of Mountaineers activities take place on federal public lands like national parks and national forests. So we kind of start there with federal and then work on down at the state level, mostly through coalitions. I'll touch on some of our state advocacy priorities and going into the next state legislative session in January later in the presentation. But, really we're effective because we're seen as nonpartisan, pragmatic, working across the aisle to get things done. done, which, as Betsy's going to speak tonight about the federal political landscape and what the Hill and Congress looks like in the last couple months of this year, and then going into next year, it's going to become increasingly important. So we like to think, and we've seen firsthand how conservation and recreation can be a bipartisan issue, and the Mountaineers is really seen in kind of a neutral way, and it's just working to leverage our community to make an impact for the lands that we love. So let's see, next slide. So our advocacy agenda, so we have 4 buckets of our advocacy agenda: landscape conservation, public lands funding, sustainable, equitable outdoor access, and climate action. So thanks for, I know we touched on that in the icebreaker question. Nate is going to put a link in the chat to a produced version of this advocacy agenda that we put together this year. So this is it's actually like I think it's a 4-page document that we've had it, use it for tabling at events. We're going to bring it to advocacy meetings, and so it's just most of what we shared already in this event and that we've shared through these virtual events is kind of captured there in that 1-pager. So an example of landscape conservation, the Wild Olympics bill. So we've been working for many years to try to protect new wilderness and the first wild and scenic river designations on the Olympic Peninsula, and some of those areas also are key recreation areas, like the Dungeness River Valley, Gray Wolf River, things like that. So that's an example of landscape conservation and how that shows up in our advocacy. Public lands funding, we'll talk about funding for the Forest Service and some of the recent hiring freeze on seasonal staff, and kind of like ways to get engaged in that work. But public lands funding is a big one, and one that we work through coalition. So our national coalition partners, Outdoor Alliance, other coalition partners here in Washington State, working through coalitions and having an amplified impact that way is a big way that we work. Sustainable, equitable outdoor access. So the Department of Natural Resources, DNR, Washington DNR, just published a draft, their first recreation management plan, so outdoor access and responsible recreation. So through some of our the permit work that we do, and also some of our advocacy and engagement with land managers, we really prioritize advocating for sustainable, equitable outdoor access. And then climate action, I saw some people put that in the chat as one of their main issues that they care about. That's great to see. I'll talk more about how we defended the Climate Commitment Act in the November election and what that means for Washington State funding moving forward. So those are some examples. Next slide. So I think everyone should be signed up for Conservation Currents and our monthly e-newsletter, but that is the best way to learn more about issues that we're working on, that we want you to get engaged in through the blogs and action alerts that we share in those opportunities. And several of them get amplified through like Route Finder, the organization-wide monthly newsletter, or in Leader Lines, which is our leader-specific newsletter. So we don't just publish in Conservation Currents, we work to kind of get that out to the Mountaineers leadership and membership more broadly. So I think a lot of you have taken Advocacy 101, but Advocacy 101, the e-learning course that we launched, really gets folks prepped to engage with lawmakers and land managers and taking action, which we're going to talk more about tonight, personalizing action alerts, contacting your lawmakers directly, calling up their office, just going on their website, submitting a web contact form, yeah, I think we have a poll question. Let's see if we can get that in the chat here. Want to know who's completed Advocacy 101 already. Yeah, and then writing letters to the editor is another way, and then submitting comment letters. So those are some ways to advocate, and we're going to workshop some letters to Congress later tonight. Next slide. Over to Betsy.
Awesome. So we had an election recently, and at the federal level, that changes things pretty substantially for Mountaineers' priorities for a lot of other things, but we won't touch on those tonight. So what does that mean for us? So we will have in 2025 single party control of federal government. I will add a caveat there that we have fairly tight margins in both the House and the Senate. So things that the majority party wants to propose will not necessarily be a slam dunk all the time. It will be will be certainly many items. Well, they will need bipartisan support. So that's something to keep in mind, that there is that narrow majority, narrow majority for the Republican Party next year. We anticipate the need to defend landscape protections and climate investments. So just like with the previous Trump administration, we anticipate a greater focus on extractive industries like oil and gas drilling, and increased logging on public lands within the land management agencies. We also saw attempts to shrink national monuments like Bears Ears under the last Trump administration, and we certainly anticipate that to happen again. We also expect the administration and Congress to attempt to redirect or withdraw funding for climate investments like those passed in the climate or in the Inflation Reduction Act. Um, and then we also expect cuts to funding for federal land management agencies, which we'll certainly have to defend against. However, we do also expect opportunities to advance bipartisan recreation priorities like the Great American Outdoors Act. That bill was passed in 2020, so under the previous Trump administration, which it funds deferred maintenance projects on public lands. And that is due to be renewed next year. And so we have a real opportunity to pass that and have it be seen as, the legacy of um, President-elect Trump and the Republican Congress. And that's great that we can get that sort of thing done, um, under a different Congress with bipartisan support. There may be other priorities. Recreation, as Connor mentioned, is such a bipartisan issue that we can see some other possibilities that we can't even imagine right now coming up. And believe it or not, we've also passed landscape conservation bills under the last Trump administration. So we will certainly be playing defense, but we will very much be working to advance, proactive bipartisan priorities as we can. So, congressional updates. What's the lay of the land right now? Some of you may have heard this term, but we're currently in the lame duck session. So, the previous members of Congress who either are retiring or got voted out are all lame ducks. And we have a few weeks here before the holiday season where we can get some of our priorities across the finish line. So, the first thing I'll start with is public lands funding. So appropriations for land managers. Congress, one of the big things that Congress needs to be getting done before the end of the year is to pass government funding. It currently runs through December 20th, and they've simply extended current funding, which they may do again, or there's a slight chance they might pass full year appropriations bills to fund the next fiscal year for the land management agencies. We are particularly concerned about the Forest Service's budget crisis. You probably got an alert last week on this. They announced about a little less than 2 months ago a hiring freeze for seasonal positions. So that means trail crews, wilderness rangers, staff who clean bathrooms, open campgrounds, that sort of thing. So thank you if you've already taken action on that. That's awesome. We'll also have an opportunity to do that tonight. This is something that unfortunately can't be totally solved by the next year's appropriations bill. It's going to be a longer term campaign for us, especially as the new Congress looks to cut federal funding. So let's stay in this fight, and we really want to advocate for our land management agencies like the Forest Service and the Park Service to have the funding that they need to protect resources and ensure outdoor access. Um, Another big priority for us for the lame duck session is a bill called the Explore Act. You've probably gotten alerts from us on that as well. This is a bipartisan recreation package. It includes key Mountaineers priorities like the permitting bill that we've been working on for a mere 8 years. It's called the Simplifying Outdoor Access to Recreation Act, and it has been packaged into this larger package called the Explore Act. It would streamline the federal recreational permitting system that we need to teach our courses on public lands. The Explore Act would also protect wilderness climbing. So it's a lot of priorities that are really important to Mountaineers programs and courses in particular. There's also several other provisions in the Explore Act to make recreation more sustainable. So that has passed the House and a key Senate committee. So that's huge. All it needs to do now is to pass the Senate and get signed into law. So we're optimistic that could happen. We're really close. It's just a matter of since time is running so tight, we want to get it attached to another bill that's moving through Congress. And so we're working hard behind the scenes on that. Right now, the most helpful thing that advocates can do is just tell Congress that it needs to be passed before the end of the year. Let them figure out how that's done. But we'll have an opportunity at the end of in our workshop to send in an action alert on that. And then the last item I'll mention is while Connor mentioned the Wild Olympics bill to designate new wilderness in the Olympic National Forest. That's something we've been working on for over 10 years. It is past time to get this done. It is a legacy bill for Congressman Kilmer, who's retiring, big priority for Senator Murray. So we see a small possibility, slim possibility of getting that done. The Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee is actively working on putting together a package of public lands designation bills. They again just need that vehicle, end of year vehicle to get them done. Unfortunately, we don't have quite as much leverage given the election results because a lot of these bills are pushed by Democrats. So we are trying, but unfortunately, it looks like it's going to be challenging to get that through, just to be honest. So that's the overview of the lame duck session. Looking ahead to the next Congress, if we don't advance, especially the Explore Act by the end of the year, we have an opportunity. Next year, we'll also be working on Forest Service funding next year and reauthorizing the Great American Outdoors Act, among other priorities. So that's your federal lay of the land, and I'll hand it over to Connor to talk about the state.
Great. Thanks, Betsy. Yeah, so as we mentioned, we don't just work at the federal level, we work at the state level. This picture here in the slide is myself and one of our other Mountaineer staff, Ryan, who works with our Tacoma youth programs, where a couple years ago we lobbied for the No Child Left Inside program, which is funding to get youth outdoors, and the Mountaineers has been a recipient of an NCLI grant before for our Mountain Workshops program. So that's just an example of some of the advocacy that we do at the state level. And I mentioned this before, but a lot of that state advocacy, we do work through coalitions like that No Child Left Inside coalition. Mountaineers programs and our community just generally gets outdoors on state managed lands. And when we say state lands and state land managers, we're thinking of state parks, Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Department of Natural Resources. So each legislative session, we engage in advocacy and track kind of what's going on. But before we look at what's coming up for this upcoming state leg session in January 25, wanted to look back and look at the election. So there was a ballot initiative, I-2117, which would have repealed significant provisions of Washington's Cap and Invest program under the Climate Commitment Act, which produces critical funding to preserve natural landscapes and to help communities and individuals reduce their carbon footprint. The Mountaineers Tacoma Program Center recently got to net zero, and we utilized CCA dollars grant funding through the Washington Department of Commerce to be able to do that. So the Mountaineers formally took a position opposing the initiative, engaged, signed on to the No on 2117 campaign, engaged in some coalition around work around some communications, and encouraged our members to vote no and join us in opposing the initiative. And we were successful defeating the initiative by a 2-to-1 margin. And so what that does is, looking ahead to the next state legislative session, we're already kind of going to be in a budget constrained environment in terms of the state budget. So keeping that CCA revenue intact for some of the advocacy priorities that we and others advocate for is definitely key, and just not taking a step backward in terms of the climate action progress that we made in the state. So that's a big one. Just wanted to call that out. We have a blog on our website that shares more about that. Another kind of storyline here in Washington from the election results is we're going to have a new commissioner of public lands. So Commissioner of Public Lands heads up the Department of Natural Resources, and we track and engage with staff from DNR and around planning processes. Mentioned the outdoor recreation planning process going on right now with DNR. So Dave Updegrove from the King County Council won that commissioner race, and he has a strong conservation record in King County and is a very conservation-minded vision for DNR and to manage DNR lands. And so we're going to be doing some relationship building there and see what opportunities arise. Hillary Franz has been doing a good job, and she's engaged with Mountaineers in our conservation work. But that's one of the storylines. And and just that change at DNR comes at a time when DNR is putting more of a focus on recreation management and highlighting recreation on their lands, enhancing it, and also conserving older forests to help fight climate change. So looking ahead to the state legislative session, priorities, the Mountaineers and our Outdoor Alliance Washington partners and the other coalitions that we engage in are going to be advocating to protect public lands funding in this budget constrained environment, holding on to what we have, and some key areas around like managing recreation impacts and supporting tribal governments. They're engaging in the kind of a state level process to study impacts to the lands where we recreate and how to manage and protect cultural and natural resources better. So that's kind of a big umbrella bucket of advocacy priorities we're going to be advocating at the state level. So and we'll share more once we get into leg session. We'll share a blog about our priorities in the new year and look to do an action alert, and we'll share that with you all. So that's what we have. We're going to pause for Q&A, see if there's any questions. I'm not seeing any in the chat, but if anyone has a question would like to raise their hand about any of the federal or state updates that Betsy and I shared. And we'll have some more Q&A at the end as well. Go ahead, Peggy.
I'm also a member of the, don't laugh at the name, Great Old Broads for Wilderness. And we've been doing some advocacy around the legacy forest that DNR has put up in auction for logging. Is that something that you've been tracking and that the Mountaineers have been acting on? Or I guess I'd like to get your take on that.
Yeah, thanks, Peggy. We have been tracking it because, as Connor mentioned, we tend to do more work on federal public lands, and there's a similar forest management process going on at the federal level that we didn't have time to mention today, but it's the Northwest Forest Plan update. The Northwest Forest Plan covers Forest Service, so national forest land in Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, in the range of the spotted owl. And I'm actually on the federal advisory committee that's advising on the update to that plan, and very similar issues. So protecting old growth forests and thinking about climate smart forest management in our new age of climate change and wildfire. So just needing to, we only have 24 hours in a day, like needing to kind of prioritize where we focus our efforts. And that was a really good opportunity for us to be really closely involved in forest management process. So that's kind of where we focused our attention as far as forest management, but we're certainly tracking the legacy forest issue, and we'll see if there are strategic opportunities for us to weigh in.
Great. And I see Doug's question in the chat. Does trail maintenance play any part in the Mountaineers advocacy efforts under the priority of sustainable outdoor access? And cites the Washington WTA's Lost Trails Found program as an example of that. So Betsy or Nate, one of y'all want to take that one?
Yeah, so we definitely advocate for funding for trail maintenance. That's kind of part of our Forest Service funding campaign, and making sure that the Forest Service has enough resources so that they can hire trail crews and be able to execute grant agreements with nonprofit organizations like WTA to do trail work. So that's kind of how we show up in terms of the advocacy space around trail maintenance. Clearly, you know, lots of you on the call are doing stewardship with the Mountaineers and doing the on the ground trail maintenance under kind of our stewardship umbrella, which is awesome. So we're kind of tackling it from both sides, from the advocating for funding to people doing the on the ground work.
Great. Thanks, Betsy. Not seeing another question, so let's go to the next slide and get ready to hand it over to Danielle, and we'll have more time for Q&A at the end. Great. So now kind of transitioning more into the role that the Mountaineers members that you all can play in this advocacy. So there's a lot here. There's a lot that one could advocate for. There's a lot of work that we have to all do together. What can one person do? Does your voice matter? And we all on the Mountaineer staff believe it does, and I think many of you believe that it does matter. And want to hear from Danielle what advocacies look like for her, how easy it's been for her to advocate, and yeah, just for a few minutes, going to hear from Danielle. And yeah, take it away, Danielle.
Thanks, Connor. Well, I wanted to start not with a story necessarily about myself, but I wanted to talk a little bit about a personal victory on our home that happened 2 weeks ago. Outdoor Alliance sent out a note about some public land spills, including the Wild Olympics, which was mentioned. And I had some information about the Wild Olympics, and my husband Andrew and I started pack rafting with the Mountaineers 2 years ago. And there's a lot of wild and scenic rivers in the Wild Olympics. So I encouraged him to write to our members of Congress. And lo and behold, about 4 days later, he got a lovely letter back from Kim Schreier, who is our representative in Congress with Washington's 8th District. And he's printed it out. He's so pleased. It's the first letter he's ever gotten from a member of Congress. And I think it was a win-win because he feels like his advocacy worked. And also he's a little bit better informed about that issue. And he's sitting right next to me. How long did it take you to do that, Andrew?
Probably took about 5 minutes. Top.
Okay. So that's 1 degree of separation. But some of the stuff that I've gotten to do this year is with Outdoor Alliance and through the Mountaineers is a training program called the Grasstops Collective. And it's 20 people who do all sorts of human-powered outdoor recreation. And we're kind of the people that you know from the crag or the put-in. And so we've been trained in how to engage our members of Congress. And then now we're kind of being leashed upon all of you to encourage all of you to do that next. So through a series of trainings and a fly-in to Washington, D.C., which you can see the picture here is all of us standing outside of Kim Schreier's office. And I was very, very nervous before this meeting. And of course, all the people in Congress are lovely. They want to talk to you. They want to hear what you think. And it's really great when you have people like Betsy there. She was sort of like my mentor. It was like my mentor lead. So I really want to encourage people, do whatever sort of advocacy works for you. If you have 5 minutes, respond to an action alert and personalize it. If you have more time, write a letter to an editor. Coming to these things are great. And I'm happy to help anyone who wants to work on a personal story or to learn more about how to get involved as a volunteer. And we've got great staff. They're super helpful with all of this, and they have lots of years of experience themselves working in Washington, D.C.
Great. Thanks, Danielle. And you all will see a blog from Danielle in our next Conservation Currents newsletter, sharing more kind of a trip report from the DC trip with Outdoor Alliance and more about her experience in the Grass Tops Collective. And I know, Danielle, I know the Explore Act is an issue that you spoke to when we were in those meetings and that you're personally passionate about. So really quick, anything you want to add on Explore? If not, we can segue to the advocacy workshop, and maybe you can do that in one of the groups. Yep.
Sure. I mean, one thing really quickly is, it'd be a lot better if we could have better access to climbing permits in Leavenworth. For folks who are climbers and climb leaders, that's an issue. For our youth programs, it would be great as well. And so the Explore Act would help simplify permitting for things like that.
Great. Thank you. All right, let's go to the next slide, Nate. All right, so now we're going to get into the advocacy workshop portion of the event. So let me stop the recording. Actually, maybe we'll keep it on until we move to breakouts, just so the folks that are interested in hearing more about these alerts. Great. So again, Betsy mentioned this is not a requirement of participating in this event, but we will break everyone out into groups. We're going to do some workshopping. The 2 action alerts that we've talked about, the take action for Forest Service funding around the seasonal hiring freeze. So your groups can choose to discuss and work on thinking about personal stories for that, or the Explore Act and thinking about how to, if you were going to take that advocacy action, how you would do that. So Nate, go ahead. If you haven't already, could you put the link to the document that we're going to have folks look at? So we have a Google Doc here, which kind of walks through some about the advocacy workshop here. But basically, we want, your role and just the advocacy that Danielle spoke to is helping build grassroots support for an issue, and telling your personal story is a big piece of that. So we're going to break out into small groups to discuss and workshop one of these action alerts. Personalized letters carry a lot more weight with a congressional office. So when Rep. Schreier gets a letter from a constituent that's personalized and really localizes the issue and talks about local impact of a piece of legislation like the Explore Act, or talks about the need for increased funding for the Forest Service and can really point to on-the-ground impacts in the district, like that letter really goes a lot further and really has a deeper impact. So when we get into groups, it's in the document, but we want you to briefly introduce yourselves and then decide on an issue together, discuss the issue, brainstorm how to infuse your Mountaineers or general outdoor experience into that advocacy action, and then think about how you individually would personalize a letter for greatest effect, and then hopefully through the links that we've shared in the event, and then in the follow-up note, go on and take that advocacy action through the Mountaineers and on our Take Action page, which we can also link to. So that's what we like to tee up for the next 15 minutes or so. Does anyone have any questions before we break out into groups? All right. Not seeing anyone. Oh, Amy, raise your hand. Go ahead, Amy.
Yeah, thanks. This has been really interesting. I'm just curious, kind of going to lame duck period, and I guess thinking more broadly than like myself, because I do work trying to boil stuff down for other folks from an organization I work for, is for something like the Explore Act, et cetera, that we're trying to get passed by end of year. Is there any value in considering and in kind of pushing for letter writing and kind of advocacy in Washington districts that might have leaned more red as opposed to blue kind of for impact purposes, given that a lot of these, acts are typically pushed by Democrats. Just curious if that really is something to consider or makes a difference.
I think it does. And I think, we talk about these issues being bipartisan, but I think those members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, hearing about recreation and why these and the Explore Act in particular would make a difference in their district, yes, that's certainly valuable. And I think going into the landscape that Betsy spoke about, I think that's going to be increasingly important. I'll just toss out through Outdoor Alliance Washington, which is a Washington network of Outdoor Alliance National that Betsy leads. We've been engaging with Representative Dan Newhouse, who's over in Central Washington in the Yakima area, who's maybe not aligned with us on some of the kind of core conservation issues, but he cares about natural resources and outdoor recreation and the outdoor recreation economy. And so we've been engaging with his office. So I think, if we have Mountaineers that live in his district or other Republican held districts in the state, there's certainly a lot of value to that. So definitely appreciate that. Okay, Nate, would you, as you're able, would you break us out into groups? Let's see, we're about 20, so maybe at least four groups.
On it. Do you want everyone to come back at 7:55, Connor?
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, we'd love to have a few minutes just to wrap up all together. Thanks.
Sweet. I'm making a breakout rooms now, and then I'm gonna assign everyone manually, so it might take a sec.
Yeah. Any other questions while we're getting everyone get into the document that needs to get into the document? Thanks for joining, Ginger. Have a good night. Okay. Everyone's already thinking about what issue they want to work on, right? Yeah. Yeah, and Nate, I know it's a lot to do this on the fly, but if you could kind of spread like yourself, Danielle, myself out, Betsy out. I'm not sure if someone has to stay in the main room. I can do that if needed, but